That was noisy. But anyway, guys, welcome to my crotch. Pleasure to have you here. I thought I'd talk about vibrato coming from the wrist. And to do that, there's loads of, to explain my thoughts on it, there's some really cool things that come into my opinions and my, what I would call my expertise. So a little bit of background about me, strength and conditioning coach, nutritionist, personal trainer, all kinds of things, health and fitness, as well as a guitarist with my bachelor's degree is in music. So it came up in conversation, people talking about vibrato in the wrist versus the fingers, and then also an expectation on why the fingers should have more control. And I'm going to talk about why that shouldn't be the case from a physiological background. So the first thing is understanding the wrist. The wrist really has two planes of motion it moves in. It has this flexion extension thing. So if I just go palm up, you can flex or you can extend. Or you can do what's called deviation. And we've got radial and ulnar deviation. This comes from moving it towards either the radius or the ulnar bone in the forearm. So we've got two planes of motion. We've got this kind of up and down handshake from the wrist type motion. Or we've got this, what would you call this? I don't know, slap type motion. Flexion extension and radial and ulnar deviation. Now, it's important to note that when we're doing vibrato, we are not carrying out any of those actions on a conscious level, or the intention of our vibrato. Our vibrato doesn't come from one of those actions being the main movement. One of those actions might happen as we resist certain forces that the wrist has to transmit, but none of those actions actually determine our vibrato. We're not kind of doing this radial or ulnar deviation, and we're not flexing or bending the wrist too much to make our vibrato. So that's the first thing. Those two planes of motions, those four actions really, they can't be in control of the vibrato. They just aren't the right planes that we're moving in. So where do you think that vibrato comes from? Well, if you were to look at my arm there, you'll see that my wrist is moving, but it's moving because it's connected to my forearm, which is connected to my elbow. And my elbow can carry out some very important actions. Again, it's got flexion and extension, which is your bicep curl or your tricep extension. That's where they get their names from. But it's also got another important action called pronation or supination. Now, if I have my hand in a neutral position and I move my palm upwards, that action is supinating. So the way to think about this is if you're going to hold some soup, you move through supination. If I turn that way, as if I'm going to, give a fist bump to someone, that's pronation. So pro like bro, give your bro a fist bump. Supination like soup. So what's really happening is, when we vibrato, most people, not people who use finger vibrato, or maybe people who've tried to force themselves to use the wrist, most people will create an anchor or pivot at the on the top of the guitar, anywhere above the middle of the neck, and then using that anchor, we're going to rotate around that point using supination and pronation. Now, why would we do that? Well, the muscles involved in that are really strong muscles, and moving that string, displacing that string, requires a lot of force. So the muscles that actually do that are your biceps. Your bicep controls supination, and then you've got another muscle in the forearm that controls pronation. So your big bicep muscle gets to bend that note up, and then your pronator gets to bend that note down. That's one of the reasons. We've got very large, strong muscles capable of doing those bends. The other reason is just talking back to people thinking that because the fingers have so much more fine control, they should be better for this action. If we look at what finger vibrato would be, which is essentially an extension of the fingers. So again, fingers can flex and extend. Those actions come from muscles in the forearm, as I'm sure you all know, and we just kind of have tendons in the hand. So that action of extension and flexion, although we are able to really finely move our fingers, there is conflicting signals and more tension created when we have to create force this way on the neck from flexion and extend the fingers distally at the more distal knuckles, the more distal joints. So we're trying to pull in, and we're kind of battling between these two forces. Now that's not a problem. We can do this relatively well, but we're using a lot of tension, and there's a very reasonable percentage that it might go wrong, which is why when people start trying to bend, they keep pulling away from the fretboard. That's due to the high demands of this coordinated effort of keeping those fingers pulling in whilst extending at the distal phalanx, as they're called. So that's kind of why finger vibrato isn't necessarily optimal. Finger bending isn't necessarily optimal. It's really difficult to do, and it's using smaller muscles than elbow vibrato. So that's just something I want people to start thinking about. Vibrato doesn't come from the wrist. It can come from the fingers, which you see in a lot of, finger down low guitar players, but it mostly comes from a coordination of the wrist being strong and static and maybe a little bit of give, but the elbow running through its pronation and supination, which is your turning a door handle, like B.B. King talks about. That kind of a door handle flick. Also, these muscles are really good at doing that movement very quickly, where if you try and flex and extend your wrist very quickly, you're not going to get very far. Same with if you try and do that. These muscles, very fast twitch, very good at doing that. So that's really what I wanted to talk about. Anything else I can think of? No, I'm just going to leave that with you there. I hope you learned something from this, and it's kind of piqued your interest in learning a bit more about the anatomy and physiology of yourselves. So good luck with that. That's my thoughts on vibrato coming from the wrist.